Hello, everybody. This is CJ Wiley with more adventures on the road. I had someone asking me yesterday about how do you stay out of traps when you're on the road and you're a hustler. And, back in the days when I was doing it professionally, it was in the 80s. There wasn't any internet or cell phones as far as taking pictures. So it was good in the fact that they couldn't identify me, but it also hindered that I couldn't identify other people. But we had an underground network that we would trade spots, and I've sat at Denny's and Waffle House and Perkins and places like that with other road players at like 3 in the morning after the place is closed, and we'll sit in there and have breakfast and some coffee and tell stories and trade spots. So they would give us the spots, like if they had come from the east and we were coming from the west, we would just trade off the spots that we'd been hitting on the way to where we were. Or if there was ones we missed, and if there was a reason we missed it, we'd give it to some other players or road players, and they, and tell them maybe how to tweak their approach a little bit to be able to take off a score. And then sometimes, you make a deal. Generally, if you steer somebody to a spot and they make money, they should give you 20%, but it has to be set up front. But that's just standard. So when I first went down to Dallas was when I started getting my real seasoning for what was to come the next few years when I was on the road full time. I was working with a player named Rick Thompson. He was from St. Joe, Missouri. And I've talked about Rick a little bit in some stories. I met him in Columbia, Missouri at the Columbia Billiard Center. And he was playing. He had a Gilligan's hat on. He was thin, kind of homely looking, but had a great dry sense of humor. And when I saw him, he was wearing no shoes or socks and had been playing for about 10 straight hours with the guy. And I saw he sat down and crossed his legs, and the bottoms of his feet were like black. I thought, man, that's wild. But he loved to play endurance matches and had an incredible sense of humor. Anybody that's been around Rick Thompson has laughed on many occasions. And, some of those one-liners, I've told some of them in the past, but they were hilarious. We would go into a town, and Rick would say, "This is my town, CJ. These are my people." And we'd pass something. He'd say, "You see that telephone pole over there? That's my telephone pole. You see that barber shop? That's my barber shop. You see that water tower over there with the town's name on it? Well, that's actually my water tower. And I charge them to put their name on it and not mine." So he would go into these routines, and so we went down to Dallas together. He'd already been down there, and he'd played like Little Al and Lizard and Baltimore Danny, or maybe not played them, but been around them. He knew all about what was going on there, and that was kind of like the college course for pool hustlers, going to Dallas, Texas, to Rusty's. It was the one on Northwest Highway, and half of it, or more than half of the building, was a strip club named Baby Dolls, and it was actually owned by a gentleman named Duncan Birch, who I ended up knowing later on in my career when I became the owner of Carson's Live nightclub in Dallas. But that's another story. At this time, I was 16, so we went down and we got a couple miles from where Rusty's was, and we pulled over at this store. Well, at the time, we didn't know, but it was a pretty bad area of town. It was Harry Hines and Northwest Highway area. And later on in my life, I found that was, where the drug dealers and pimps and prostitutes. And there was girls walking around at night, hookers, just like on TV. I'd only seen them on TV, but it was wild because, that Dallas, I could go on and on about the things that I learned in Dallas. I actually know the people behind the scenes that that run the city a lot more than the ones you see, especially more than the mayors and the politicians. But anyway, that's another story for another time. We pull in that convenience store, and Rick pulls over. Actually, I was driving. I went over by the gas pumps while Rick went in to get some cigarettes and something, drinks. I stayed out and pumped the gas. Well, when I was pumping the gas, I could feel somebody behind me. I look around, and there's this guy, and again, I was 16 years old, so I didn't realize this guy was messed up on drugs. And he said, he flashed a badge on me and said that he was a police officer, and asked me how old I was and wanted to see my driver's license. And I told him, I said, well, I'm 16 years old. And he said, in the state of Texas, son, you got to be 17 to drive a vehicle if you're from out of state. He said, and he pulls his shirt back and grabs some handcuffs. Now, when I saw those handcuffs, I knew something was getting to be very real, and I knew I was in danger. And, I didn't know if he had a gun on him or not, but those handcuffs looked pretty menacing to me. So luckily, right as he was, getting the handcuffs out, and I guess he was going to try to handcuff me. That was going to be a little harder than he thought. But Rick came out right at that time, and he sees something going on. He said, what's going on here? And the guy turned around. He said, this boy's not old enough to drive in the state of Texas. You got to be 17. He's only 16. He says, I'm going to have to take him to jail. And Rick saw those handcuffs, and of course he was way more seasoned than I was. I think he was like 27 at the time, 28. And he said, played it off. He was like, officer, is there anything that we can do to keep him from going to jail? Like, can we pay a fine? Can we just pay some money? And of course, that was, the trigger point, that I was a little too scared and paralyzed at the time to really think about. But of course, that's what he wanted, was money, or he just wanted me. But he knew he couldn't get me with my partner coming out there, so he told us it'd be $80. And I still remember he wrote the receipt on like a scrap piece of paper. I mean, it's been a long time ago, so my memory isn't real clear. But I swear it was like he tore off a piece of a notebook paper or something and write the receipt for the $80 and gave it to us. So anyway, he took off, and we jumped in the car and headed towards Rusty's, and I was kind of shaken up. And Rick was like, trying to, talk some sense to me, because I was, I was like, man, that guy was a cop. And Rick was like, he wasn't a cop, CJ. He had a badge, but that doesn't mean he was a cop. He said, not all people with badges are actually police. And I was like, well, what did he want? And he said, well, just what he got, that money. But the handcuffs, Rick's like, yeah. He says, I don't know about that one. He says, you might have been in for, more than you bargained for if I hadn't come and stepped in, which he was right, So anyway, I remember that night there was a Sammy Hagar concert, because when we were driving the 3 miles to Northwest Highway, we turned on the radio and they were talking about that Sammy Hagar concert. I Can't Drive 55. So I just had that happen. We're going to the pool room, and people are whizzing by, because Rick was laughing about how, I guess they saw the I Can't Drive 55 concert, because nobody was driving the speed limit. So we went up to Rusty's. We pulled up in the parking lot, and there was 3 strip clubs. There was Baby Dolls, and then there may have been 3 more. There was 2 others across the parking lot. So there was always a lot of cars and activity there. And, a lot of people with cash money. So it was just ideally located. I remember someone that became a friend later, Ben Tubbs, used to throw the red card, and he and his partner Bubba beat these security guards out of like 1,500, or it might have been 1,500 apiece. It was a lot of money. These guys were patrolling the parking lot and had uniforms on. They came in and they got them in that red card game. And again, when they were doing it, Ben was throwing the red card, Bubba was the white guy, so you had that contrast, and he was the shill. So what that means is Ben and him were actually in together, but nobody knew it. So when they threw the red card, when Bubba would pick it and win in front of people, because it looks like an easy game. You just throw the red card and you end up, you got to pick, usually there's 2 black and 1 red, and you got to pick the red card. But the thing is, see, they're not actually gambling. So when Bubba's winning, then Ben will just say, I can't play with you anymore. He says, you're too good, you're too lucky. But the people that saw him win will gladly take his place and get in, because they already saw that the same card that he picked was the same card they were going to pick. So it's a perfect trap. And so, of course, when they get in, Ben might even lose the first one on purpose or do something. But one of the greatest tricks was he would look like he accidentally bent the red card, and then when he's throwing it, he will unbend the red one and bend the black one. So now people are absolutely for sure that that bent card is the card that they need to pick to win the money. And of course, when they put the money down and he pulls that card up, you should look at their face. It's priceless, because they'll never win. You'll never win playing against that red card or a shell game or anything like that, because it's a rigged game, and once you know it, you can never be fooled by it. So I was being schooled by Rick, and like I mentioned a few of the players before that were hanging around there, and there was Black Sam and Mexican Ralph, Fat Ralph, and of course the Lizard and Little Al and Baltimore Danny and John Hager Sr., Jack Cooney, Frisco Jack. Bugs was coming down there at that time from Chicago, and Torpedo Max, and Tommy Reyes, TR. These are all pretty big gamblers and very serious, as far as their knowledge level. They've been around. They got lots and lots of miles on them. So like I said, that pool room right there was where to get educated. So I'm glad Rick took me there. But and also glad I didn't get handcuffed the first gas station we stopped at. So we're out in front, and Rick's kind of giving me the lowdown on all these players, and I generally I'd write it down and like the names of the players and kind of a brief description, and so then if I got stumped, I'd just go to the bathroom and take it out, and I could, I had my cheat notes with me. One time I dropped those in a bathroom, but again, that's another story for another time. You don't really want to drop a list of players that's in a pool room in the bathroom, because when they find it, they're going to think that's very odd, especially if they're on the list, and you've got a star by their name and saying you got to get this guy stuck from the beginning or he'll quit, but if you get his nose open, he'll go off for like 2,000 or 3,000. So if you read that about yourself on a list that you find in a bathroom, you might not want to gamble for a couple of days. You might want to take a real careful look around you, because you're getting hunted. We were hunters. And so Rick not only gave me that list of names, but he also told me who was kind of in together and who wasn't, because that's a real important thing to know too. Because in professional gambling, and this isn't just pool, this is all sports, there is what we call business going on in every sport. And if you watch much of the NFL, I've got a friend that finds those funny plays and makes videos about them, and it's obvious that there's some fishy stuff going on. But that's just the nature of money. If there's a lot of money to be made in any way, shape, or form, you're going to come across hustlers trying to get it. So Rick told me about that game too, because sometimes you'll get drawn. If they can't beat you, they'll draw you into betting on somebody else. And that's what we call putting on a lemon show or lemonade, or just putting on a show, or theater. Those are just slang for, what they're really doing is usually dumping off somebody. And the dump is when one player is getting backed and staked, which means they're getting the money put up, and they lose on purpose. But there's other kinds of shows and lemonades as well, like the one that Strong Arm John and I did in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where they didn't know we were together, so I went in and passed myself off as a drug dealer, and I've told that full story before, but I lost like $2,800 to John the first day that I was in there, and then another, was it $3,500 and $2,800? That's we played two different times, and I lost both times. And then when I went up to the bar, of course, the house detective, he's the busybody that wants to know everything and wants to knock everybody. And this type of person wasn't very popular in my days with the hustlers. They would, if they knocked games, which meant, told who the hustlers were and not to play them, they would usually do something rude to them, like put something in their drink, to make them where they need to go to the bathroom real well, and then they're real bad, and then they would lock the bathroom door. I think they were like horse. They were for horses. If you take something that'll give a horse diarrhea, you know what it'll do to a human. But that was just the way it was back then. It was a lot more serious. See, now people that knock games are almost like honored in a way, and they're celebrated. But that was not the case in the times that I grew up. So Rick told me all about that, and like I said, it was there's different types of laying down a lemon. That's what we were doing with Strong Arm John, because nobody bet on me, so nobody lost any money except for John, and we were together, so nobody lost any money at all. So you see what I mean? It was just a show. So nobody knew that but us, so nobody could figure it out. And one of the main things I learned, and I learned this from Junior Weldon Rogers, is when you're putting on a show, it's always good to have bickerments and like maybe argue over a bad call or bad hit, or some misunderstanding where you wolf at each other, where you almost get violent. Because when people see that, then you pretty much got them hook, line, and sinker, because they see one player getting shitty with the other, and it's also good to talk bad about the other person to a few of the players around that home pool room. So like if Strong Arm of John and I are together in that room, it's good for me to go over to the bar afterwards and talk shit about him, and it's good for him to do that too, so that they won't possibly put us together. Of course, in that case, there was a day about probably a month and a half later where they did start figuring it out, but we were okay with that at that time, and really didn't care. For the most part, when you do something like that, you generally leave the state for a while, in case somebody on your list might be a little dangerous, because you can always get retaliation. So that was my introduction to Dallas, Texas, was Rusty's. And I ended up playing Little Al, getting the Wild 7 ball. And the only thing I was trying to do was get up there, because Little Al was kind of labeled as a lamb killer. Now, he was a really good player, but what I mean by a lamb killer is when he's playing a lamb, which is somebody that's not that great a player, he can play, like my speed or like a champion's speed for a while, He looks more unorthodox doing it, but he can deliver that level of play. But when he plays somebody like my speed, the whole thing changes. So that's what we call a lamb killer. And I'm not going to take anything away from Al. He's won some big tournaments and stuff. But that was just the line that I got on him from Rick Thompson back in 1981. So in Lizard, I knew that he was backed by this big gambler TR, but he was more cautious, more calculated, a little bit smarter. Didn't drink and do drugs, so it's hard to get him off center. That's another thing we look for, is especially if somebody did any kind of hard drugs and they had somebody behind them. A lot of times those guys would have drug dealers behind them, backing them, so you could win a lot of money and they wouldn't quit because they had unlimited drugs from the guy. And, at some point, I'm going to get them so weak that I'll just beat them every game. But for a long time, it might be tough. I figure, some of those guys, I could usually break them down in like 8 or 9 hours. Usually, if they could last 10, that was pretty strong. And then once I got them weak, I could pretty much beat them. I didn't really peak out till about 20 hours, and I could hold it for about 10. But I was in really good shape. Omaha John was the same way. He ran 5 miles every other day, and he was in real good shape. So he was a real good influence for me, and he could play for 30 straight hours. But we had to back then, to get the money. Because another thing about those times is you couldn't really quit winter. So if you got ahead of a guy like 20 games and he wouldn't quit, you couldn't just lose back 10 and quit, because he would expect to be able to get all of his money back. So it put you in and I've been in this situation many times where I'd get up like 15 or 20 games, and then I can see that the guy's getting in stroke, and now I know I have to beat him into submission to get out with the money. So either I have to come with it, that high speed, and or I'm going to end up breaking even, and even that isn't good. If somebody comes back and you quit even, you look like a wussy, and you kind of get a bad reputation. I always had a real good reputation because I would never quit. Sometimes I'd play like 3 or 4 people straight, and I generally end up losing all of it. I did that several times, but that's how I got my conditioning. Everything that I know was really, kind of learned the hard way, through, when you got, street wisdom, it takes a lot of pain, usually to get that knowledge. So we stayed down there for a few days and gambled with people, and I learned a lot about matching up and the psychological part of playing pool, and especially how to get the money. But it was more by watching these guys and listening to them and observing them, because like I said, Rick Thompson and Little Al and Lizard and Baltimore Danny, they were all seasoned players, and they were all quite a bit older than me. So I was like a sponge. So, the question is, how do you know, at least what separates me in how I look at these such situations that's kept me safe from getting involved with them, or at least knowing the right side of these situations pretty much every time. I mean, I got a super good track record, but I learned that from, Rick told me about, the lemons and people putting on a show, and don't get involved, because if you stick your toe in it, you might get it chopped off, because you got to know which side is going to win if that lemonade is going on, if they got the lemonade stand. So the way that I was taught to do it was by my Asian partner, Dalton Leone. Dalton Leone was super wise. He looked like Bruce Lee, but I've told a few stories about our experiences. But what he told me about being able to see the theater and the shows is he said you always have to look at every person and every matchup as if it is a show. Then you prove to yourself that it isn't. So I look at things the opposite of what most people do. They'll look at something like it's true and then try to figure out if it's false or not. But you see, that doesn't work because they never can end up proving that it's false unless it's very obvious and somebody just tells them. But they can't really figure it out. But if you think it's a show from the beginning, that the players are in together and they know who's going to win, and if you just believe that from the beginning, it doesn't have to be true. Just believe it for as long as it takes. And generally it takes me just a few minutes, but sometimes it'll take longer because I'll see one of the players get emotional during the match and maybe some voices raised. See, when that happens, I will think even more that they're in together, not less, more. So I'll start paying more attention and I'll kind of look at what the emotion is about, and then I'll evaluate especially who's got the money behind each player. If one player's got, a millionaire behind them and the other player is on their own money, see, the odds of that being a show and a literal dump go up significantly, probably 3 or 4 times at least, maybe 10 times. If they're from the same city, state, or country, it goes up 3 or 4 times. I mean, I can tell stories about seeing matches, and I can tell right away. If they shoot a shot that isn't right, the thing about champion players is they don't hardly ever shoot a wrong shot. I mean, there's different ones they can take, but whatever they do take, I can figure out in an instant why they did it and why, it raises their percentages or, what the strategic, planning is behind that shot. I can tell right away. And I can also tell if they do it inappropriately, because it will give them more of a chance to get hooked by a ball or they're snookered, or give them more chance to miss the ball, if they put more English than necessary. Or there's lots of ways that you can miss balls on purpose. But generally, the greatest players will hook themselves or they'll get out of line because they would rather do that than try to intentionally miss a ball. Because sometimes that's hard to do. It's hard to miss one on purpose and just barely miss it. That's probably the most I've ever aimed. When I used to stall and have to miss balls on purpose, that's when I would really aim. If I wasn't doing that, I really, I've told you guys how I aligned every shot. I really don't have to aim. I just feel every angle, and it's pretty easy for me. But when you're missing on purpose, it's a whole different situation. So Dalton told me that I got to look at everything like a show, everybody like they're a hustler, and then prove they're not. And that has made me a lot of money, and it's saved me many times. So even in the big stage, if you're watching something on TV, I just look at everything like it's a show, just like a TV show. And that both of the people know each other and everybody's just working together and it's a scene, just like a movie, like we're in a reality movie. And then from that attitude, I try to prove myself wrong or prove that wrong. And I want to prove it wrong. However, most of the time, especially these days, you find out that it was theater all along. So as far as protecting yourself and thinking more like a professional hustler, when you're in a pool room, and I do it pretty much all the time, but especially when you're in a pool room and you're around really sophisticated gamblers, that's just a good idea, is to look at every person as if they're smarter than you and they're a better hustler than you, a better gambler than you, and the players that are playing, are actually putting on a show for everybody, so that you got to figure out which one's going to win. So it makes you think a lot more, and it stimulates your imagination, and basically makes you a smarter gambler and a smarter person, more streetwise, I would say. They don't teach this stuff in a university or in a classroom, but this is the school of hard knocks that you learn this, pool school. So if you like my techniques, systems, and fundamentals that I've used to become the ESPN World Champion and be named the Player of the Year, thank you, Pool and Billiard Digest, I will give you my website. It's cjwiley.com, or you can go to masteringpocketbilliards.com, and I've got a heck of a deal for you. Got lots of knowledge on there for $15. So if you want to help me out, I'd appreciate it, and I will keep bringing you as good a content as I can. Until next time, this is CJ. I'll talk with you soon.